We all have some wounds or scars on our heart from the times when we've been hurt or mistreated or unloved. Some of those wounds are real easy to forgive and let go of and move on. But some hurts are so deep and painful that we find it hard to forgive. You might be able to remember right now, sometime in your life when somebody has done you wrong or caused you harm. Maybe you've already forgiven them long ago. Or there might be some hurts that you have not yet forgiven. The fact is that one of the greatest causes of our own emotional and spiritual problems is our own refusal to forgive when somebody has hurt us. But the message of God in our scriptures is that we must forgive others. For example, when Jesus teaches us how to pray, and He gives us the Lord's Prayer, it says, "Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us." Or then in Ephesians chapter 4, St. Paul says, "Put away from you all bitterness and wrath and anger. Forgive one another, as God in Christ has forgiven you." And then Paul in another place, in Colossians chapter 3, says, "Just as the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive." And in Sirach chapter 27, which was the first reading in the Mass today, it says, "Forgive your neighbor's injustice. Then when you pray, your own sins will be forgiven." Jesus teaches us over and over in the Scriptures that the measure we measure out to others will be measured back to us. And that also goes for forgiveness. And in today's gospel parable, Matthew chapter 18, He drives home the importance of forgiving other people. And the way that Jesus composes that parable is in 3 separate scenes. In the first scene, we encounter this king who forgave the servant a huge amount. Now, literally, in the Greek text of Matthew chapter 18, it says that it's 10,000 talents. That's the equivalent of 150,000 years' wages of an average worker. That's an amount that guy never would ever have been able to repay that king. But the king wrote it off, just forgave it all. Then comes a second scene where that servant refused to pass on the gift of forgiveness of a much smaller amount. And literally in the Greek text, it is 100 denarii, which is the equivalent of 100 days' wages. Imagine, 100 days' wages compared with 150,000 years' worth of wages. That's a huge difference. Then comes the third scene where the king called back the servant and he punished him for his lack of mercy. He sent him to the torturers until he should pay back the whole debt. And that's a big debt. So in that parable, the king represents God and the servant represents us. And Jesus' point in Matthew chapter 18 is that God forgives us first without us ever having earned it. God forgives us, not because we deserve His forgiveness, but simply because it's of the essence of who God is. God is merciful. And then, of course, God expects us to pass on that gift of forgiveness to others who don't deserve it either. But Jesus makes a really good point in those amounts of debt, that our mercy toward other human beings is a tiny fraction of the mercy that we have already received from God. A very key message of Matthew chapter 18 is that if we refuse to forgive others, God will revoke His forgiveness of us. If we refuse our mercy to others, God will withdraw His mercy from us. So why don't we forgive? If it is so essential to being a Christian believer, Why don't we? I think one of the main reasons why we don't forgive is that we don't quite understand what it means to forgive. Forgiveness comes so much more easily when we realize what it is and what it is not. So first of all, let's explore what forgiveness is not. Forgiveness is not a denial that you have been hurt or harmed. It does not mean that it's okay what the offender did to you. If there had been no harm done, then there's nothing to forgive. Forgiveness does not mean tolerating wrongdoing or allowing some injustice to continue. And forgiveness does not necessarily mean that you will totally forget that hurtful event. We don't have to erase our memories somehow in order to forgive. Just because we remember does not mean we have not forgiven. Also, forgiveness does not mean that you must continue to be the offender's friend. You must forgive. And then you might need to keep a safe distance from that person to keep them from harming you again. And forgiveness does not mean that you have to have some sort of warm, fuzzy feelings toward the person who hurt you. To forgive is essentially an act of your will, not your emotions. And when we forgive, we're not doing a favor to the one who did us wrong. We're doing ourselves a favor. Because forgiveness frees the one who forgives from carrying the burden of bitterness and resentment. So that's what forgiveness is not. Now, what we're going to do is look at a basic model for a Christian process for forgiveness. And this is a model that any of us could follow. So I invite you, think about someone who has hurt you, someone who has harmed you, and now we're going to go through this process, which is actually 12 steps. The first step, ask for God's help and healing throughout this process. Never underestimate the power of God's grace. Second step, be willing eventually to let go of your unforgiving stance. Step number 3, recognize that you have been harmed. Fourth, acknowledge and accept your feelings about what happened. You don't have to deny your feelings. The fifth step, think clearly back on that situation and think about who in that situation bears responsibility for what. In fairness, you should not take on blame for somebody else's wrongdoing. There might be some things that you did wrong, but you have to make sure you're clear on who's responsible for what. That's the fifth step. Now, the sixth step is to develop a more realistic view of yourself and the offender. You might have been holding them up on a pedestal. Now, develop a more realistic understanding of who you are and who that other person is. Seventh, you exercise your free will. You make a decision of your will to choose to forgive the offender. In some cases, that's a decision that needs to be made repeatedly in order to become complete. In the eighth step, you don't expect the offender to respond to your forgiveness in a particular way. Their response is up to them, and your forgiveness does not depend upon their response. Now comes the ninth step. You place that offender in the hands of God, and you trust that God is ultimately going to deal with that person according to God's justice and mercy. You leave them in the hands of God because you yourself don't need to keep on punishing that person. You place them in God's hands. Then comes a 10th step where you allow plenty of time for your feelings to catch up with your decision of your free will. Some hurts, because they're so profound, will require more time, even for your decision to forgive to take place. Next comes the 11th step in this process of forgiveness. In the 11th step, you choose to let go of the past and to live in the present and go forward into the future. Finally, in the 12th step, you choose what will now be the nature of your relationship with the offender. It might be different from in the past, and you choose what are going to be your appropriate boundaries with that person. So those are 12 steps that anybody can take. And if you take steps like that to forgive, you can resolve any bitterness or resentment that you might have been carrying in your heart. No matter how deeply we have been hurt, we really can forgive.